the rising artist. Elijah Carter was born in the small town of Willow Creek, where life often felt like a battle against the odds. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had little exposure to the arts, but he found beauty in the everyday struggles around him. His mother, a seamstress, stitched vibrant fabrics with intricate designs inspired by their African heritage. Elijah often helped her, fascinated by the colors and patterns that seemed to tell stories of a faraway land he had never seen. Art became his refuge from the challenges of his environment. The streets of Willow Creek were lined with abandoned buildings and graffiti-covered walls, but Elijah saw them as canvases of untapped potential. He began drawing on scraps of paper, cardboard, and anything else he could find, using crayons and markers gifted by a kind neighbor. His sketches were raw and honest, reflecting the resilience and beauty of the people around him. As Elijah grew older, his passion for art deepened. He found solace in creating, often losing himself for hours in his makeshift studio, a small corner of their crowded home. However, his talent wasn't always met with encouragement. Teachers dismissed his work as childish doodles, and peers mocked his aspirations, believing art was a path to nowhere. Yet, Elijah's mother believed in him. "Your hands," she often said, "can make the world see what words cannot." By the time Elijah reached his early 20s, his art had evolved into a unique blend of modern abstraction and traditional African motifs. His paintings were bold and unapologetic, layering vibrant colors with sharp geometric patterns. Each piece told a story of heritage, struggle, and hope. Despite his talent, opportunities in Willow Creek were scarce. Determined to make his mark, Elijah saved up every penny and moved to the bustling metropolis of Crestview, a city known for its thriving art scene. The transition was jarring. Crestview was a world of glittering skyscrapers and fast-paced lifestyles, but beneath the surface, it harbored an elitist art community that seemed impenetrable to outsiders. Elijah began attending gallery openings and exhibitions, hoping to network and find a foothold. However, he quickly realized that his identity and style were often met with subtle, and sometimes overt, prejudice. One such encounter came during an open exhibition hosted by Jonathan Pierce, a renowned gallery owner known for his discerning eye and harsh critiques. Elijah, hopeful but nervous, arrived with 3 of his best paintings, carefully wrapped and ready to present. The gallery was packed with aspiring artists, each vying for a chance to impress Jonathan. When Elijah's turn came, he unwrapped his pieces, his hands trembling slightly. The room fell silent as the crowd took in his work, bold strokes of color intertwined with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with life. For a moment, Elijah thought he saw admiration flicker in Jonathan's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Jonathan stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "Interesting use of color," he began, his tone sharp enough to cut through Elijah's hopes. "But it's unmarketable. Too ethnic. Too loud. My clients prefer subtlety, something that complements their spaces, not overtakes them." The words stung, but Jonathan wasn't finished. "This isn't art, it's chaos," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, eliciting a few chuckles from the audience. "Perhaps you should consider a different profession." Laughter rippled through the room, and Elijah's cheeks burned with humiliation. He fought the urge to pack up his work and run, instead standing his ground, his jaw tight with determination. "Thank you for your feedback," he said, his voice steady, despite the ache in his chest. "I'll take it into consideration." As Elijah left the gallery that night, he carried his paintings and the weight of Jonathan's words. Yet, beneath the hurt, there was a spark of defiance. He thought of his mother's belief in him, the stories woven into his art, and the resilience that had brought him this far. "I'll show them," he muttered to himself as he walked through the city streets, the lights of Crestview reflecting in his eyes. "One day, they'll see my worth." That night marked a turning point for Elijah. The rejection didn't break him, it fueled him. He resolved to prove that his art, and the culture it represented, deserved a place in the world, no matter how many doors were slammed in his face. This was just the beginning of his journey. The Hidden Collector. The days following the gallery rejection were difficult for Elijah Carter. He couldn't shake the memory of Jonathan Pierce's mocking tone and the laughter of the crowd. Yet, every time he thought about giving up, he remembered why he started painting in the first place. His art wasn't for the approval of elite curators or high society collectors, it was for the people like him, those who carried stories in their hearts and struggled to find spaces to tell them. Elijah threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He rented a small, rundown studio on the outskirts of Crestview, barely able to afford the monthly rent. The space was cold in the winter and sweltering in the summer, but it was his sanctuary. Surrounded by canvases, brushes, and tubes of paint, Elijah found peace. His art began to reflect his emotions more vividly: frustration, hope, resilience. He layered his canvases with bright colors, intricate patterns, and powerful textures that seemed to leap off the surface. Word of Elijah's work began to spread in his local community. The small art fairs and pop-up exhibitions where he showcased his paintings drew modest crowds, but among them were people who truly connected with his art. They saw the stories he was telling and the soul he poured into every piece. Slowly, Elijah started to gain a following of local supporters who appreciated his work's emotional depth and authenticity. One of these supporters was Margaret Westwood, a wealthy art collector known for her discerning taste and her ability to spot unpolished talent. Margaret was an enigma in the art world, rarely seen at the flashy gallery events, but known to wield incredible influence behind the scenes. She preferred to seek out artists whose voices had been ignored or suppressed, building her private collection with pieces that told stories of resilience and identity. Margaret first encountered Elijah's work at a small community art event held in a converted warehouse. She was immediately captivated by his paintings. Standing in front of one of his larger pieces, a chaotic yet harmonious swirl of vibrant colors and intricate patterns, she felt as though she could hear the unspoken struggles and triumphs of Elijah's life. "Who is the artist?" Margaret asked the event organizer, a young woman who spoke passionately about the artist she represented. "His name is Elijah Carter," the organizer replied. "He's incredibly talented but hasn't had much luck breaking into the bigger galleries. You should meet him." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "I want to see more of his work first." Over the next few months, Margaret quietly purchased several of Elijah's paintings. She ensured her transactions were handled discreetly, knowing that some artists struggled with the idea of having their work owned by a wealthy collector. To Elijah, the sales were a lifeline. Each piece sold meant he could keep his studio for another month, buy better supplies, and continue painting. Elijah, however, remained unaware of Margaret's identity. All he knew was that someone out there appreciated his art enough to invest in it. With each sale, his confidence grew, but he stayed grounded, focusing on honing his craft rather than seeking recognition. Margaret, meanwhile, began sharing her newfound treasure with her circle of influential friends. She hosted intimate gatherings in her sprawling estate, where she showcased Elijah's paintings alongside works by more established artists. The reactions were immediate and overwhelmingly positive. "Who created these pieces?" asked one guest, a prominent curator from London. Margaret smiled. "His name is Elijah Carter. He's an emerging artist with a voice that demands to be heard." The curator leaned closer to one of the paintings, captivated by its layers and storytelling. "He's brilliant. Why haven't I heard of him before?" "Because the world isn't paying attention to the right people," Margaret said simply. Soon, word of Elijah's talent began to spread beyond Crestview. Critics, curators, and collectors started discussing his work in hushed tones, eager to uncover more about the mysterious artist whose pieces evoked such powerful emotions. Margaret's influence ensured that Elijah's name reached corners of the art world he couldn't have imagined. Back in his studio, Elijah remained blissfully unaware of his growing fame. He rarely attended high-profile events and had no interest in social media or self-promotion. For him, the act of creating was its own reward. He spent hours experimenting with new techniques, layering colors in ways that seemed almost impossible, and infusing his work with an even deeper sense of purpose. One day, as he stepped back to admire a newly finished painting, a vibrant explosion of color depicting the strength of community, he felt a sense of quiet pride. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about telling stories that needed to be told, whether or not the world was listening. But the world was beginning to listen. And soon, Elijah would discover just how far his art had traveled, thanks to the hidden collector who saw his brilliance before anyone else. This was only the beginning. The breakthrough. Margaret Westwood had always believed that the right timing was everything in the art world. For months, she had carefully positioned Elijah Carter's paintings within her network of influential art enthusiasts, ensuring that his work garnered the quiet reverence it deserved. Now, it was time for Elijah to step into the spotlight, even if he didn't know it yet. The annual International Art Fair of Paris, a prestigious event attracting collectors, curators, and critics from around the globe, was the perfect stage. Margaret rented a prime booth, reserving it exclusively for Elijah's work. To maintain the mystery surrounding him, she chose not to display his name or provide any information about the artist. Instead, she let the paintings speak for themselves. The booth, starkly minimalistic, was adorned only with Elijah's vibrant, evocative pieces. Bold colors and intricate patterns leapt from the canvases, demanding attention and evoking deep emotion. Each painting seemed alive, pulsating with the stories and heritage that had inspired them. From the moment the fair opened, Margaret's booth became the center of attention. Visitors paused, captivated by the sheer power of Elijah's work. Whispers spread quickly among the attendees. "Who is this artist? I've never seen anything like this before. It's raw yet refined. It feels like the paintings are telling me something I can't quite grasp but deeply feel." Critics scribbled notes furiously, while collectors lingered, mesmerized. Offers began flooding in within hours. By the end of the first day, 3 of Elijah's paintings had been sold for prices far exceeding Margaret's expectations. By the end of the fair, every piece had been purchased, setting a new record for first-time exhibitors. The art world buzzed with excitement. Articles and social media posts speculated about the identity of the mysterious artist. Was it a seasoned painter using a pseudonym? A revolutionary new talent? The lack of information only fueled the intrigue, turning Elijah's work into the centerpiece of conversations across the industry. Meanwhile, back in Crestview, Elijah remained oblivious. He was still in his studio, putting the finishing touches on a new piece, when his phone rang. It was Margaret. "Elijah," she said, her voice warm with excitement, "I have some wonderful news. Your work was showcased at the International Art Fair of Paris." Elijah paused, confused. "What? I never signed up for that." "I know," Margaret replied with a chuckle. "I did it on your behalf. Anonymously, of course. And you won't believe what's happened." She explained the overwhelming success of the booth, the critical acclaim, and the record-breaking sales. Elijah sat down, stunned. He had never imagined his art would reach such heights, let alone captivate the world's most influential collectors and critics. Margaret continued, "But, Elijah, the time has come for the world to know who you are. People are demanding to meet the artist behind these extraordinary works." The following week, Margaret arranged for a public unveiling at her estate. Invitations were sent to the most prominent figures in the art world, including the collectors who had purchased Elijah's paintings. The evening was elegant and understated, with Margaret ensuring that Elijah felt comfortable amidst the grandeur. When the time came for the reveal, Margaret stood at the center of her gallery, flanked by Elijah's paintings. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice commanding attention, "it is my honor to introduce you to the artist behind these magnificent works, Elijah Carter." Elijah stepped forward, his heart pounding as the crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and murmurs of admiration filled the room. For the first time, the world saw the face of the artist who had taken the art scene by storm. His presence, humble yet confident, only added to the mystique surrounding him. The unveiling was a media sensation. Headlines praised Elijah's talent and celebrated his journey as a self-taught artist who had overcome systemic barriers. The art world couldn't get enough of his story, and demand for his work skyrocketed. He was inundated with offers for exhibitions, commissions, and collaborations. Among those reading the headlines was Jonathan Pierce, the gallery owner who had mocked Elijah at his open exhibition. Jonathan stared at the screen, his face pale. The same artist he had dismissed as unmarketable was now the talk of the industry. Regret gnawed at him as he recalled his condescending words and the laughter he had incited. Unable to ignore the rising tide of Elijah's fame, Jonathan decided to attend one of his public exhibitions. Standing at the back of a crowded gallery, he watched as visitors marveled at Elijah's paintings. Their reactions were genuine and deeply emotional, something Jonathan had failed to see years ago. As Elijah addressed the crowd, speaking about his inspirations and journey, Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. He realized he had not only underestimated Elijah's talent but had also failed to recognize the power of the stories embedded in his work. For Elijah, the breakthrough was not just about fame or financial success. It was about validation, the acknowledgement that his voice, his heritage, and his art mattered. And as he stood before the crowd, he vowed to use his platform to uplift other artists who had been overlooked, just as he once had been. This was his moment, but it was only the beginning of an even greater purpose. Elijah Carter was no longer just a rising artist, he was a force reshaping the art world. The turnaround. Elijah Carter's meteoric rise in the art world brought him wealth, recognition, and opportunities he could have only dreamed of a few years ago. Yet, despite his success, Elijah had never forgotten the humiliation he endured at Jonathan Pierce's gallery. The sting of that moment had driven him to prove himself, not to Jonathan, but to himself and the world. Now, with his reputation firmly established, Elijah decided it was time to return to Crestview. The city welcomed him back like a returning hero. His name was on the lips of every art enthusiast, and his paintings were prominently displayed in the city's most prestigious galleries and museums. But Elijah's return wasn't just about celebrating his success, it was about reshaping the art world in the city that had once rejected him. An invitation to a high-profile industry event brought Elijah and Jonathan Pierce face-to-face for the first time since that fateful exhibition. The event, a lavish gala for collectors and curators, was held at a historic venue in the heart of the city. Elijah arrived dressed impeccably, exuding confidence and poise. Margaret Westwood accompanied him, her presence a testament to her continued mentorship and support. Jonathan spotted Elijah across the room and froze. The once dismissive gallery owner now faced the undeniable reality of Elijah's success. His name had become synonymous with innovation and excellence in the art world, while Jonathan's gallery, struggling financially, had faded into obscurity. Elijah approached Jonathan with a polite smile. "Mr. Pierce," he said, extending a hand. "It's been a while." Jonathan hesitated before shaking Elijah's hand. "Elijah Carter," he said, forcing a smile. "It seems you've been doing quite well for yourself." Elijah nodded. "I have. It's amazing how things can change in just a few years. I owe a lot to those early experiences, especially the ones that challenged me." There was no malice in Elijah's tone, but his words carried weight. Jonathan's face flushed as he realized the subtle reference to their previous encounter. Before he could respond, Elijah continued. "Your gallery, it's been a cornerstone of this city's art scene for decades. I've heard it's facing some challenges recently. I'd hate to see it disappear." Jonathan stiffened, embarrassed by the mention of his gallery's financial troubles. He forced a weak chuckle. "The market has been tough, but we're managing." Elijah tilted his head thoughtfully. "If you ever consider selling, I'd be interested. I have some ideas about how to revitalize it, make it a space for emerging artists, especially those who might not fit the traditional mold." Jonathan's jaw tightened. The offer, though polite, was a stark reminder of how far Elijah had come and how far Jonathan had fallen. The conversation lingered in Jonathan's mind long after the event. His gallery, once a beacon of prestige, was now on the brink of closure. High rents, dwindling clientele, and his reputation as a difficult gatekeeper had taken their toll. Jonathan knew he had little choice but to consider Elijah's proposal. A few weeks later, Margaret reached out to Jonathan on Elijah's behalf. She offered a generous price for the gallery, enough to clear Jonathan's debts and give him a chance to start anew. Initially resistant, Jonathan eventually relented. The sale was finalized, and Elijah became the proud owner of the very gallery where he had once been mocked and dismissed. Elijah's first act as the new owner was to transform the space into a haven for underrepresented artists. He named it the Carter Collective, a nod to his vision of community and inclusivity. The gallery's inaugural exhibition featured works from diverse artists, many of whom had never had the chance to display their art in such a prestigious setting. The event was a resounding success, drawing crowds from across the city and beyond. Jonathan, now unemployed and grappling with his loss, attended the opening night of the Carter Collective. He stood in the back, watching as Elijah addressed the crowd with a mix of humility and passion. "This gallery is more than a space for art," Elijah said, his voice steady. "It's a place for stories, for voices that have been overlooked. My journey began with rejection, but it's led me here, to a space where everyone is welcome, where art can truly thrive." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jonathan felt a pang of regret. After the speech, he approached Elijah, unsure of what to say. "Elijah," Jonathan began, his voice hesitant. I want to apologize. For the way I treated you before. I was wrong. Your work, it's extraordinary. You've proven that." Elijah regarded Jonathan for a moment, then offered a small smile. "Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. We all make mistakes, it's what we do after that matters." The moment was both humbling and redemptive for Jonathan. Elijah's grace in the face of his past humiliation spoke volumes about his character. Jonathan, now introspective, offered to mentor young artists at the gallery, hoping to contribute to the vision Elijah had created. Elijah accepted the offer, not out of pity, but because he believed in second chances. Together, they began building a space where art flourished, barriers were broken, and the stories of those once overlooked were finally heard. The redemption. The transformation of Jonathan Pierce's old gallery into the Carter Collective marked a new era for the art world in Crestview. Under Elijah Carter's leadership, the gallery became a beacon of hope and opportunity, prioritizing the voices of underrepresented artists from marginalized backgrounds. What once was a space that dismissed individuality and culture was now alive with bold expressions of identity, resilience, and creativity. Elijah ensured that the gallery's exhibits featured a diverse array of talent, from emerging Black painters to indigenous sculptors and immigrant photographers. The space also hosted community workshops, artist talks, and mentorship programs aimed at fostering talent and breaking down the systemic barriers Elijah had faced in his own career. The gallery's success not only attracted attention from the art world but also sparked important conversations about inclusivity and equity in creative spaces. One day, as Elijah reviewed submissions for an upcoming exhibit, there was a knock on his office door. He looked up to see a familiar face, Jonathan Pierce. He looked different now, his once confident demeanor replaced by humility and uncertainty. He was holding a portfolio under his arm. "Elijah," Jonathan began, his voice quieter than Elijah remembered. "I wanted to thank you for the way you handled everything. You didn't have to, but you gave me a second chance. I've been thinking a lot about my mistakes, how I closed doors instead of opening them." Elijah gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Jonathan?" Jonathan hesitated, then placed the portfolio on the desk. "I'd like to help. I know I've lost the trust of a lot of people, and I don't blame them. But I have experience, decades of it. If there's a way I can use that to mentor young artists or help this gallery, I'd like to try." Elijah studied him for a moment. Jonathan's tone was sincere, and his words carried the weight of someone seeking redemption. After a pause, Elijah nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right," Elijah said. "If you're willing to commit to the gallery's mission and the artists we support, there's a place for you here." Jonathan's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Elijah. I won't let you down." True to his word, Jonathan became an integral part of the gallery's mentorship program. His years of experience as a gallery owner gave him insights that helped young artists navigate the complexities of the art world. More importantly, his story served as a powerful example of growth and accountability, inspiring those around him to challenge their own biases and assumptions. Elijah, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. On a quiet evening, after the gallery had closed for the day, he stood in the main hall, gazing at a wall covered with the works of the gallery's latest exhibit. Each piece told a story, stories of struggle, triumph, and identity. They were stories that might never have been seen if not for the platform the Carter Collective provided. Margaret Westwood entered the room, her footsteps echoing softly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, standing beside him. Elijah nodded. "It's everything I wanted it to be, and more." "You've done something incredible here, Elijah," Margaret said. "You've turned rejection into opportunity, not just for yourself, but for so many others." Elijah smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you. You believed in me when no one else did." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "I saw your potential, but this? This is all you. You've created a legacy." As Margaret left, Elijah remained, his thoughts drifting back to his beginnings. He thought of the small town streets of Willow Creek, the nights spent painting in his cramped studio, and the humiliation he'd endured at Jonathan's gallery. Those experiences, painful as they were, had shaped him into the person he was today. Elijah walked over to a mirror mounted near the entrance. He looked at his reflection and saw not just himself, but the faces of everyone who had ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. He saw his mother's hand stitching vibrant patterns, the kind neighbor who had given him his first art supplies, and the community that had believed in his vision before the world did. "I did it," he whispered to himself. "We did it." The Carter Collective continued to thrive, its walls filled with stories that refused to be silenced. Elijah's journey, from rejection to redemption, became an enduring symbol of perseverance and the power of community. And as he stood at the heart of his gallery, Elijah knew his purpose extended far beyond his art. It was about creating space for others to dream, thrive, and be seen.